So I'm here today to talk with you about digital culture as a catalyst for change, arts education, and creative rights. I think it's an interesting time to be teaching. I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples. We'll talk a little bit about Barack Obama and a little bit about Lil Wayne to get at some of this. I've been very interested in thinking about how teachers ought to respond to the catalysts of digital culture, right? It's a very different world. And at the same time, I've got a lot of hope that there are many things that we can do and that there's interesting art that's coming out there. This is an image that was digitally created by the artist Shepard Fairey, called by the New Yorker critic Peter Schjeldahl the most iconic political piece of artwork since the Uncle Sam I Want You image. If you followed this at all, you probably also know about this part of the story, which seems to follow so many art stories these days. The AP accusing Shepard Fairey of deriving a work from one of their photographs, Shepard Fairey accusing the AP of falsely claiming copyright, what is often called copy fraud. And at the same time, you've probably also seen plenty of these. Remixes by amateurs, right? This is the ecology of creative work today in the visual arts. Someone can come up with something, someone else can remix it, someone else might come in and try to sue over it. The same kind of stuff is happening in music. And if we look at Lil Wayne, one of the albums he released in 2007 was called The Drought 3. This was a leaked mixtape that was never officially released or sold. And that entire album consisted of remakes of other people's songs. He'd sample the beat, loop it, write his own new verses. Here's one that he did over Young Dro's song Shoulder Lean. It's called Live from 504.
Feel sick, so sick, need a doc, yes. A creature, monster like the Loch Ness. I get hotter by the top before I sizzle to death. I just tell the clock, give me a sec.
So making his own version of a 2006 song, his own verses. And then also actually plundering that verse with a DJ and putting it out under another song that you probably also recognize. Same lyrics.
So sick, need a doc, yes. A creature, monster like the Loch Ness. I get hotter by the top when I sizzle to death. I just tell the clock, give me a sec.
And you can tell that's 1965's Help by the Beatles. And what they do in the hip-hop loop is, of course, to make it make sense, they repeat the last utterance of help.
You know I need someone.
And because it's hip-hop, you need to add some drums and some keys, too. And the incredible ease with which artists are able to do that today is nothing short of shocking. So the way that folks are sampling the Obama ad, the same kind of things are happening. And oftentimes when music comes to exist, it comes through a process like this, where Young Dro's song inspires Lil Wayne's cover version with new lyrics, which then gets reinterpreted through the Beatles with some new lyrics to release a different version. It was something that Lil Wayne did the entire year of 2007. No official releases, all unofficial. Incredibly prolific. He was releasing 3 and 4 songs every day. New compositions. Even more than Bach's 1 cantata a week, right? So many that in November 2007, Vibe magazine's cover story was the top 77 songs of 2007 that you should download from Lil Wayne. Pitchfork magazine's critics said he's released more work for free of higher quality this year than most artists release in their entire career, right? And this was not just a form of altruism. It honed his skill and his craft and led to his album in 2008, The Carter 3, which sold 2.8 million copies that year, was the #1 selling album in the United States. Enough for 2.5% of all U.S. households to have a copy. Pretty impressive. It would be one thing if this were just something that were in the marketplace, but these same kinds of creativity are happening in classrooms, and the classrooms that you'll be working with, and the students. Professional tools in the hands of amateurs allow people to make videos, put them up on YouTube, and let the whole world see them. Students using programs like GarageBand to write their own songs, and inexpensive hardware to record things and put them out there. Here's one example of how this happens in my own classroom, or I have students often record a poem to learn how to use a microphone. One of my students, Genevieve Noble, recorded a Charles Baudelaire poem. Here's a sample.
Imagine the magic of living together, there with all the time in the world.
And she put that out on the internet with a Creative Commons license that invited other artists to remake it and remix it, just like with Lil Wayne. And in less than a week, she came back to class with this version.
Imagine the magic of living together, there with all the time in the world, for loving each other, for loving and dying, where even the landscape resembles you.
And if you don't like that version, a week later, somebody else, another artist whom she had never met, took the same poem and created what we call the slow jam version.
Imagine the magic of living together, there with all the time in the world, for loving each other, for loving and dying.
And what a wonderful thing for this student to see her work done in a classroom take on the relevance, to be connected with the whole world, to see other people use it. One of those versions was put up, and the musician said, I think this would be great music for a film, so inviting other people to extend that creativity even further in new ways. So there are three ways that I think we can think about digital culture as a catalyst for change in the arts. The first is with regards to content. We've gone from scarce physical content to overabundant digital content. These are just some of the leaked mix albums that Lil Wayne put out in 2007. And instead of just going out and buying a single Beatles album, you can go ahead and download millions of hours of stuff, legally or illegally, of course. Having all this digital content available has profoundly reshaped creativity from making and more individual works to remaking and remixing, right? This is a Wikipedia image that depicts the evolution of the Obama image from the photograph that it originally derived from, right? So we're seeing how creativity is very different, or there are new ways to be creative more easily than that were the case in the past. Also, there are changes in culture. Lawrence Lessig talks about moving from a read-only culture, where 40 years ago when my father was in music school, he could just buy an album and listen to it. That was his only option. Corporations released the content, and individuals would consume only. Now it's a read-write culture. And by that, you can see some of these images. Anything that you can get your hands on digitally, you can remake, you can repurpose, and you can re-release to the world. It happens from everything from the Howard Dean Scream to Pants on the Ground to the Star Wars Wedding, right? Ripping and remixing is a part of our culture and our creative culture and the work that our students do. Lastly, of course, there are implications for copyright, as we started with. This reality that it's often the case that artists who create work are transgressing the tight boundaries of copyright in ways that are actionable. And anytime somebody actually makes a lot of money, it's not uncommon for one of the rights holders to pop their head up and look for a case through a lawsuit, as was done to Shepard Fairey, multiple times to Lil Wayne. So to recap the first part of this talk, I wanted to paint a picture that creativity has changed, that digital culture has been a catalyst for change in the arts. And it's part of the ecology that we're going to be a part of, and our students who were born digital are going to be even more a part of. You've got this in your handout, but also just to textually sum up, we've talked about changes in content, creativity, and culture, how those have impacted copyright. And it begs the question, what approach we should use in our classroom. I think there are two options. There's a compliance approach that's most commonly found, and there's an approach that I've been trying to promote called the creative rights approach. I'll go through both of those. You can say that copyright is too complex for you to know about it, but you can never say you weren't warned once, or maybe twice, or maybe 10,000 times. Every time you've ever put in a VHS tape or a DVD, you've seen these FBI warnings, you've seen these Interpol warnings. The message from content creators is clear. You, they suspect, are a thief. And they want to make sure, just like they give the boxers the rules every time they start a fight, that any time you go to watch a piece of content that you're warned not to do something illegal with it. Corporations also often have websites, Microsoft's MyBytes, where they invite artists to rail against copyright. The Boy Scouts have, the chapter in LA has a Respect Copyrights badge. The title alone gives you a sense of the flavor. And the curriculum, which you can download from the web, was created in part with the Motion Picture Association, the recording industry. and is very much about not stealing and respecting the rights of the copyright creators, right? There are books that you can buy, James Frankel's book here, very heavily oriented towards knowing the things that you can legally do, which makes sense. Given so many warnings, teachers want to know, what can I do? So the compliance approach, how you can do things, what you're legally able to do, is all that's on offer for the most part. Music Educators Journal, we're actually teaching music from Music Educators National Conference, had an article, What Every Music Educator Needs to Know About Copyright, and all you need to know is, there's the pull quote, and there's the image. They do send cease and desist letters, they do bang the gavel, and they do throw the book. They will come after you, you are a pirate, and they will catch you. So compliance is the overwhelming frame that's presented for teachers, and it's presented to invite you to become an intellectual property cop, policing your students and making sure that they obey the law in this time of change. And I wouldn't be against that, except I deeply believe that we can't comply, we shouldn't comply, and here's why. To start with, the industry knew this all the way back in 1987 when, here's a clip from a comedy movie called Amazon Women on the Moon.
Gather round the buckles and feast your eyes on this. Hey, all the illegal copies you want. Put it on. Aye, aye, Captain. Oh, I'm so scared.
You probably feel largely the same way that they feel. So culturally, there is a feeling, especially among younger people, that there's nothing wrong with accessing content that's freely available, that information wants to be free, etc., whether we disagree with that. But it also makes light of a deeper problem, which is a huge chasm between our own social norms and the letter of the law. Law professors call this the norm-law gap, and John Turanian in the Utah Law Review estimates that if you don't illegally download any music or any movies, you're still liable for damages that he estimates in his scholarship to the tune of $4.5 billion each year, which is mind-blowing. But the letter of the law is such that if you have ever violated copyright by, for instance, forwarding an email or sending someone a digital photo that someone else took and sent you, you are redistributing their expressive creative content that they have the exclusive right to, and you have violated copyright to the tune of $150,000 per infringement. There's a huge chasm between the norms that we all agree with and that the law would probably be comfortable with, which hasn't caught up with. Would also be nice if copyright were simple. There are a few black and white examples. To illegally download Amazon Women on the Moon is against the law. To create your own image of Barack Obama from your imagination is totally legal. But if you really want to get into understanding copyright, you're going to end up with something like this. This is just a fraction of the books that I have, never mind the hundreds of articles, just to try to understand how copyright and creativity function in the field of music. It's incredibly ambiguous and complex. Some legal scholars, such as Lawrence Lessig of Harvard University, say this is intentional. It consolidates power in the hands of corporations and disempowers individuals. And one of the takeaways from reading through these thousands of pages is that you can find out what you can do, but still, anybody can sue you. And this often happens that frivolous lawsuits are filed around copyright because of its ambiguity. So even though there's a huge gap between the norms and the laws, copyright law, if you try to adhere to it, is incredibly ambiguous. There are also large tensions between copyright and creative practice that I think I've depicted up to now in this lecture. So copyright law hopefully will catch up with the way people are being creative today, but it hasn't yet. And these tensions are substantial. And if we try to comply, we're going to cut out from our classrooms the heart of today's creative practice, a way that I feel very negatively toward. Lastly, in trying to be compliant, because it can often be expensive, materials are presented to students. This is music, Silver Burdett's music textbook series, which was created by one of our alums, Bennett Reamer, now emeritus at Northwestern University. And when students got their hands on this textbook, they must have been pretty excited when they opened up to page 5 and saw Move to the Beat and the discotheque, roller skates, etc., etc. They thought they were going to get the Bee Gees, but of course that would have cost too much money, and instead they get a book filled with When the Saints Go Marching In and other public domain materials. And it's funny, but it's also horribly sad. Bennett Reamer said at a conference a few years ago that his biggest professional regret of his entire career was the omission of popular music, because it's made it seem that popular music wasn't worthy of study. And this has had an impact on so many individuals who choose not to favor music education, all the way up to the president. Let's go back to Obama, who on the campaign trail in Wallingford, Pennsylvania in 2008, speaking about the importance of the arts, couldn't resist going off script for a moment. And this is what he had to say about his music education.
I mean, you always had an art teacher and a music teacher. You could be in the poorest school district in the world. Now, I'm not saying music was always exciting, right? I mean, sometimes, you know, the teacher would be making you sing songs that, you know, are from like the old show tunes, you know. I had one music teacher make me Oklahoma, where the... Yeah, I was more into Stevie Wonder, so there was a...
Right, there was some kind of a large gap between the music he loved and the music that the teachers felt they could include. Something that distanced him in a way that it shouldn't have happened, and that the teachers didn't want to have happen. Copyright ends up wrapped around our necks in ways that I think makes compliance impossible. Just for those reasons: the gap between laws and norms, the inherent ambiguity of copyright, tensions between creative practice as it's currently experienced in copyright, and the omission of popular culture in the blind adherence to copyright where we don't want to spend too much money creating text materials. Some of that's been worked around through the internet. But it begs for some kind of an approach that, while including compliance, it's not like we want to turn around and tell students to download anything they want, is more effective. And that gets at the heart of what we want to teach. So this is the alternative approach that I'd like to present. It's what I call the creative rights approach. And it started by just going back to read the original copyright law in the U.S. Constitution. Progress Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution, that says Congress retains the right, quote, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So instead of compliance, instead of an FBI warning, in my classes, and I invite you in your classes, to start with the idea that we have copyright to ensure progress in science and the arts, to incentivize innovators to harness the marketplace in some way. If I come up with a great idea and I can make some money off it, I'm more likely to come up with some great ideas. That's the idea behind it. And so in trying to enact a creative rights approach, starting with the Constitution, omitting the thousands of pages, but starting with something simple and memorable, to want to create innovators. We want this school, the University of Illinois, to continue to create innovators, as we have done successfully for a very long time. At the start of that, for me, I wanted to share my own students' work. I think the most profound way to teach copyright is to recognize that their own works have value. So I use a form. I can get you some copies. I've got them on the net for people to download. A creative work release form. Whenever my students create something in my class, whether it's making a ringtone or a public domain poem, they've made something that they own. And I want to recognize that by asking them for their permission. And I developed this form that kind of outlines, well, if you want to release it under copyright, these are the things that people can do with it. If you want to release it under a Creative Commons license, which is a sub-license of copyright, here are some other things. Or if you want to just release it to the public domain, here are all the things that people can do. And they sign their name, and then they check a box to either say, I'm keeping this under copyright, and I don't want to give copies to the rest of class. Others can have a copy. Let's put it out under Creative Commons. Let's put it out into the public domain. And that very simple act of asking them for their permission recognizes that the works that they create have value, that they've made something that they own. And it's, I hope, far more likely to produce more innovators and creators than telling them simply not to steal. Once you start to do this, the light gets shown upon the larger curriculum. So the second thing I'll talk about briefly is not the food pyramid, but thinking about what the creative diet for students could include and ought to be. I've developed my own heuristic in my teaching, which is a creative rights pyramid. If we want our students to be inventive, if we want them to do all kinds of interesting things, then the primary part of their diet should be works from the public domain that have no restrictions, old Bach and Beethoven, that students can record, remix, redistribute, reuse, and wreck to their heart's content without checking with anyone, or their own original works, which in the end is one of the things I want students to do anyhow. I want them to be creating, to be writing their own songs, to be sharing their own materials. So the large portion, the bulk of the diet in the class, if we want to create innovators, should be materials with no restrictions. With fewer restrictions, as we work our way up towards the most restrictive, the Creative Commons that allows for different sub-licenses where people can build upon something or share it or maybe sell it or not sell it, do whatever they want as long as they attribute the author. There's tons of work on the web that you can get at. There's even a filter in Google to get you toward content that's remixable and reusable, and that's a great part of the creative diet in the curriculum. Freely available copyright works include things like the Grateful Dead, who've allowed for the redistribution, as long as it's non-commercial, of all their live concerts on archive.org, but also things like videos on YouTube. So I'm always happy to include materials in my class that are under copyright, but that students can get at and can do things with. And there's a lot we can do with fair use around these as well. And lastly, the smallest part of the diet should be materials that are just under copyright. An amazing new novel, an album by the Beatles, something that I can say, well, all we can do, we can study this, and then you're going to have to go out and buy it, and there's not much you can do with it, but it's so darn important for us that it deserves to belong in the curriculum, right? Mostly what they get is like this. They get tons of copyrighted materials, or worse, materials from the public domain that aren't acknowledged, so that you've got something that you can do things with, but you're not told you can, right? So we want to work towards some kind of a diet in the overall curriculum where students know that they can do things and they can start to engage in the marketplace, right? In my own classes, we end up doing this ritual where we go back and plug in all the things we did in the semester and see how well we did with regards to trying to achieve a diet that's less restrictive. And to give you a quick example of, well, what does this look like, we went in my technology class to the Sousa Archive for American Music and got our hands on one of Sousa's original sketches, which we learned Sibelius by creating a legible version, and a digital score that we released to the world, and remixable versions in MIDI, etc. And then invited students, now that you've got this and you own it, to create whatever you'd like. And our Thousand Flowers bloomed with everything from video games that included Sousa music, to interviews with scholars to put out there for other students to learn from, to jazz a cappella versions, piano reductions, visualizations, music videos, biopics, and an interactive social network. All motivated by the fact that the students knew that they could own and do with as they pleased whatever they created. So we start with the individual, of focusing on them being able to understand what their rights are when they create something. We make sure that the curriculum has moments for students to play with materials freely. And then the last, but most important part for me is to include some kind of a sandbox for creativity. Instead of compliance, what I'm interested in letting my students know is that in pursuit of their own learning, they should do whatever they want. If they want to remix Barack Obama with Madonna, go ahead. But know that you can't easily release it commercially. You'd have to get Barack and Madonna's record labels permission. And that kind of thing can happen. But I want them to understand that they can do whatever they wish in my class. And here's an example, a short excerpt of a different poetry assignment one of my students did.
And the window was open, and it was so true, and I was singing it. I was almost screaming it, and I was like, damn, why didn't I just say it? And I wished you were driving next to me on the highway. Not even in the same car, but in a different car right next to me.
And what she did there, Julianne took a poem that was out under Creative Commons for recording and remixing and sharing, but it was a poem that was based on a song, and so she downloaded a couple different versions of the song and threaded in different versions of the song that the poem was based upon underneath to amplify the meaning. And it's actually a really, really beautiful piece. And she wasn't able to get a hold of the famous musicians, but she shared the final result with the poet, and she has it for herself, and she learned a lot, and she said something to me that I asked for permission to share. I'll let you read it. So to fuse together things that she loved and to find something that made her the most excited she'd ever been about an assignment, it didn't even feel like an assignment. I feel like most teachers deserve 2 or 3 of these in their life, and I'm so thankful that in allowing students to be playful, this young music educator was able to feel this way about her work. So let's wrap up. One of the ideas that I wanted to make salient for you today is a description of the creative culture and creative ecology that we're in that's digitally based and that is profoundly different from earlier modes of creativity. That students are doing this kind of work and will be doing more, and that there are 3 approaches that we can use in thinking about our own teaching. We can recognize their intellectual contributions as a positive approach in opposition to the compliance approach. We can think about the creative diet that we offer in the materials we choose to organize our classrooms around, and we can ensure that students feel free to pursue learning in any way they choose, as long as when they're working with transgressive works with regards to copyright, that they keep it in some kind of a sandbox. So that, I hope, offers you a vision for yourself as an artist and an art educator in the digital age. And I want to thank you for listening, and we'll have some time for some comments and questions. So thanks very much.